Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. With many people convinced the monsoon session of Parliament is a washout, and with the BJP's own MPs proposing to undermine its key land acquisition amendments, where does the government's economic agenda stand? And could the government now be preparing itself to face a significant political as well as an economic setback? Those are the two key issues I shall discuss today with the Minister of State for Finance. Let's start with the story that's all over the front pages today. All 11 BJP members of the Parliamentary Committee looking at the land bill are actually proposing amendments which would effectively undermine your own key amendments to the 2013 Act, which proposed to do away with the social impact assessment as well as with the consent clause as it exists in the 2013 Act. Is this therefore the beginning of a stage whereby your government is now going to give up on your key land acquisition amendments?
Well, good evening, Karan. It's a real honor to be on your show, and I'm very glad we're getting a chance to talk about the economic agenda, which we are working very hard on. As far as the Land Acquisition Act is concerned, both the Honorable Prime Minister and the Honorable Finance Minister have said over and over again, as well as other senior cabinet ministers, that it's very important on such a delicate and sensitive issue to forge a national consensus. And the process that we've undertaken over the last year and a half to forge such a national consensus has now resulted in this committee coming up with this set of recommendations. If these are the recommendations and if this is the national consensus that will truly be durable and will carry everybody along, then naturally we should absolutely consider it and take it forward.
But the national consensus that is being by what your MPs are actually tabling as amendments, and remember all 11 of your MPs are doing it, actually undermines what your ordinance did in December 2013 and which you repeated in 3 subsequent ordinances. In other words, the national consensus is a complete reversal and U-turn on behalf of the BJP.
Well, the legislation is a process of iterative consensus building and ensuring that you can carry everybody with you. This is not the
at the cost of giving up your own position. That's the cost of carrying everyone with you.
Our position, Karan, our position is the national position. It's the national consensus. It is the position that will ensure that all stakeholders are happy and satisfied with the outcome.
Absolutely. At the cost of doing what Congress wants and what the opposition wants and what your government had insisted was important and necessary. Now you've changed your position and given it up.
My understanding of what has been tabled, and of course it's not something that I have spent a lot of time studying yet, but
it's in all the papers today in detail.
My understanding is that on certain important areas we have in fact moved forward. In certain other important areas we have gone with the national consensus. I believe that there were some 672 submissions to the committee in terms of...
And 670 were in opposition to what you intended in your ordinance.
And Karan, that is precisely what it means when you follow a democratic process and you forge a national consensus. If the national consensus is that these matters should be in the bill, then of course in a democracy and as we are responsive to the people of India, we will certainly consider that.
You're a very clever politician and I applaud you for the way you're phrasing yourself, but what you're saying behind the disguise of claiming that you're going with the national consensus is that actually the BJP has given up its position. You've done a completely total U-turn. You have agreed precisely with the Congress and the opposition over 3 key demands. You've decided to accept their position on the social impact assessment. You've accepted their position on the consent clause. You're probably going to accept their position on things like also the 5-year clause and on scrapping land corridors and any acquisition of land around land corridors. Now that, if it is the national consensus, is the Congress position, not yours. And I put it to you, this is a victory for Congress and a defeat for the government.
Well, again, I think it's you, Karan, who's playing with words. I think our goal is to serve the people of India, to serve them in the way that best meets their interests and best meets India's long-term interests. And in doing so, obviously, we have to take into account what the stakeholder views are and what it is that we have to put in place to make people feel comfortable that when they give up their prized land to which they have a very deep, long, emotional connection, a connection that's been developed and built over generations, that connection cannot be sundered through...
How come this wasn't in your mind when you passed the ordinance in December, when you repeated that ordinance 3 times round? This clearly wasn't the driving force when you were passing ordinances. How come it suddenly occurred to you now?
That indeed is the magic of the democratic process, and that is because we are such great democrats.
Are you doing this under pressure from your allies, the Akali Dal, the Shiv Sena?
this is under the representation, as I said, of a broad array of stakeholders. And any time any legislation is put together, Karan, we have to take into account the needs and the desires expressed by stakeholders.
Have you been blackmailed by Swadeshi elements like the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, a member of the Sangh Parivar, or the Bharatiya Kisan Sangh, a member of the Sangh Parivar? Have you suddenly found that your allies on the political side and your allies on the ideological side have got the ground under your feet, and so you now embrace the national consensus, which actually you were committed to opposing and challenging?
No, I don't think we were committed to opposing or challenging anything. I think Honorable Prime Minister, when he spoke about the Land Acquisition Act in Parliament, did a wonderful job in saying, if you have suggestions or if you have modifications that are truly representative of what is in the best interest of the Indian people, we are absolutely, as part of the democratic process, open to that. And we have demonstrated, in fact, that ability to be able to listen, to understand and improve.
And to do a U-turn, which is the most important thing. And I applaud you for the clever phraseology that you deploy for disguising the fact that you've completely reversed your position. But let's move on. So far, all 11 of your MPs are passing amendments that are going to change 6 out of the critical 9 changes you brought to the original 2013 Land Acquisition Act. But there are 3 changes. As of now, we don't know what's going to happen to them. And I want to ask you about them. One of them is the critical 5-year clause, whereby originally, if land that had been acquired had not been used for the purpose for which it was acquired within 5 years, it would revert. Now, will that also be reversed by your MPs on Tuesday, as some people expect?
Well, we'll have to see what happens on Tuesday.
Which sounds as if, yes, it will.
But with the idea of the 5-year returning of land, we have to consider what it actually implies. You have to recognize that many of the public purposes for which land is being acquired cannot be resolved in 5 years, particularly once you include the social impact assessment.
So this may last then?
I think there is a logic to it. And again, as I said, when you go through the legislative process, Karan, as you well know, you have to take into account what the stakeholder views are and what the consensus is.
So on this little amendment, you've actually found a spine and you'll stand by it, but on the other ones to do with the consent clause and the social impact clause, you've buckled under either opposition pressure or your own Sangh Parivar pressure. You may be smiling, but that smile seems to concede my point.
No, not at all. You may want to make your point, Karan, by using your language to try and ensure that it seems like we've taken a U-turn, but I reject that notion because, again, we have to go back to what the democratic process is about and what a government that is capable of understanding, what is going to endure.
What a wonderful excuse democracy is, isn't it? When you want to do a U-turn, suddenly democratic principles come to the fore. It never occurred to you that these very principles were being used by Congress when they were saying don't do it, when they were pointing out that you were part of the consensus that pushed the 2013 Act. Then there was nothing wrong in doing a different thing.
Karan, you have to understand how the thinking proceeds on an important subject like this. On the one hand, we obviously want to make it possible for public purposes to be able to acquire land speedily and effectively. So that's one purpose.
That you suddenly now resiled from by going away from these amendments.
No, again, we have to understand.
Social impact is back, the consent clause is back, therefore it's not going to be easier to acquire land. CII is complaining about it today.
Karan, that's what I'm saying, that there are 2 sets of considerations that have to be balanced out. If you let me complete, I'll say that, right? Which is, on the one set of considerations are around how to acquire land for public purpose. By the way, I don't understand why CII would be involved in this, because this is land intended for public purposes, and this is part
land
of the
corridors were affected. Now they're going to be excluded, and therefore any advantage they got is gone.
You have to understand the industrial corridors also just intended for the land to be owned by the government. This is a fallacy that I want to make sure everybody knows, that the Land Acquisition Act, as it was being amended, it was intended purely for public purpose.
Sadanand Gowda,
so
your law minister,
Sadanand
Gowda, your law minister, in an interview to this program specifically said that the land acquired for industrial corridors would be owned, in fact, by the industries themselves. It would not be owned by the government.
Well,
he made it very clear.
All right, then I stand corrected. But as far as my reading goes, that land would have been
Let me come back to what I call the significant U-turn, which for people is very worrying and which represents to many people the first sign that your economic agenda is in trouble. I'm going to quote to you what Arun Jaitley said so forcefully and for many so convincingly when you passed your first ordinance in December 2014. He said, referring to the Act you were amending of 2013, it is a highly complicated process of acquisition which renders it difficult or almost impossible to acquire land, And referring to the Regional Act, it can hurt India's development. He added, that act completely ignores the developmental needs of society and mandates that India doesn't grow. Now, your MPs, by taking us back to that act and to that act's clauses, actually are undermining the logic of Mr. Jaitley. He is the embarrassed man today.
No, I think the answer is that you have to look at how you balance competing considerations. One is the set of considerations that Mr. Jaitley has spoken about, and those are the considerations associated with acquiring land speedily and effectively.
And the other?
To ensure that, you know, industrialization and land for housing.
Those considerations have been put on the back burner, if not forgotten.
No. There is a reconciliation and balancing process, which is what democracy is all about. Those are absolutely genuine and correct considerations.
How good and smooth you are with these words. Reconciliation suggests a middle ground.
Karan, if you let me complete, I'm sorry, you've been talking over me, so I would appreciate it if you'd let me complete at least. So there is one set of considerations that are associated with the effective and speedy acquisition of land. There is another set of considerations that is associated with dealing with stakeholder concerns and the concerns of people that actually own the land. In a democratic process, on the basis of consultation with stakeholders, these considerations have to be balanced. That's what the democratic process is all about, is finding that balance point.
I'm quarreling with what you call finding a balance. I'm quarreling with the use of the word reconciliation, because both of those suggest a sort of middle ground. What you've done is to completely give up the territory you'd staked out, which Mr. Jaitley had claimed so convincingly and so forcefully was essential for India's development, and you've now switched literally 100% to the Congress and opposition position. You claim that you've now achieved a consensus, no doubt you have, but you've achieved that consensus by giving up your position and embracing someone else's, and that someone else is the opposition. I applaud you for it, in the sense that you've used clever language to disguise what you've done, but the truth is, this is a defeat for the government, a victory for the opposition, and a huge setback for what Arun Jaitley considered good development.
I wouldn't say that. First of all, we have to see, you know, exactly how and when the legislation is passed. But in any case, the fact of the matter is that we have to put in place something that will be durable, that will be enduring, and that will reflect the national consensus. Okay. And that's really the process we've embarked on. We have done it in the spirit of democracy. We've done it in the spirit of being a ruling party that wants to listen, that wants to take into account all these considerations, and obviously at the end of the day we have to find the balance point. Now, as if the national consensus is the balance point is over here, then through this iterative process of understanding all the stakeholder concerns, we find where the balance point is.
How smooth, how clever you are with words.
I think you may call it being clever with words. I call it the hard work of governance.
Well, if capsizing to the opposition is the hard work of governance, yes it is. It's very hard to take this sort of huge embarrassment, but you're taking it with a smile.
No, not at all.
Let me come to one more question.
No, Karan, in this case, no, you're not right at all. This is not a question of capsizing to the opposition. This is finding out what the people of India want. And if the people of India want it here, then we are here to be able to ensure that the interests of India are fully protected.
You had the faintest idea what the people of India wanted earlier, that those ordinances were against the interests of the people of India, and now you at least realized it.
Democracy is the iterative process of understanding what will work with all stakeholders.
One quick question on land acquisition before I come to GST, the other critical issue that seems to be in jeopardy today as well. Are you in favor of the proposal that was sounded out at the recent Niti Aayog meeting, and which seemed to find favor with Mr. Jaitley, that the government would now leave it to the states to move their own particular specific land acquisition amendments? Will such a clause feature in whatever land acquisition bill you finally bring to Parliament?
I think we have a spirit of governance that is around cooperative federalism. If indeed states have very good ideas, practical ideas that can advance their development agenda, of course we in the centre are going to listen to it and see how we can advance their agenda.
Well, you have to do more than listen. You actually have to have a clause in the bill which permits the states to bring their own amendments.
I think my own understanding of the Land Acquisition Act right now is that is going to be possible, and of course that is possible in any case.
So that means that key land acquisition amendments to do with scrapping social impact assessment, to do with scrapping consent, will now happen, if they happen, at the state level, not at the central level. That is crystal clear.
I think we will have to wait and see exactly how the legislation is put together.
Minister, let's take a break at that point. We've discussed land acquisition very substantially. People will form their own opinion about exactly what the government intends and what its consequences will be. Let's come back after the break and turn to the other key aspect of your economic agenda, the GST bill. Will it pass? Will it fail? What will be the implications if it doesn't pass? And how will the government handle that? All of that in a moment's time. That's an equally important part of this discussion. An interview with the Minister of State for Finance on where the government's key economic agenda stands this evening. Let's then come to GST. With Congress, after yesterday's suspensions, boycotting the Lok Sabha for 5 days, with some 9 or 10 other parties choosing to do the same, with the Rajya Sabha continually disrupted, do you accept that it's extremely unlikely that in these circumstances the GST bill will be passed during the monsoon session?
Well, we are always hopeful. We continue to be hopeful.
Hope is one thing,
indeed,
reality is another.
We are going to keep imploring and pleading with our colleagues in Parliament, for God's sakes, let's pass this legislation.
Imploring and pleading is not an expression of confidence and success. Clearly, what your answer is saying to me is that you will try, and you will try to the last possible moment, but you're not confident of succeeding in passing GST in the monsoon session.
Well, the numbers, of course, Karan, as you know, are what they are in the Rajya Sabha. This is a constitutional amendment. It requires a 2/3 majority of the voters that are present in voting, and so the numbers are what they are. So therefore, we have to appeal to people that this is in India's national interest. This will enable us to create jobs. It will enable us to advance our economic growth, and therefore this is of utmost importance for India, and we should not let revenge politics or disruption politics obstruct what is in India's best interest. And I spoke earlier, Karan, about forging a national consensus. Let me tell you,
you'll forge another national consensus.
No. Let me tell you, while we on the one hand on the Land Acquisition Act are forging a national consensus and moving forward on that basis, the Congress on the other hand, a national consensus on GST that was built over 9 years is now being overturned because of their disruption and their revenge politics.
You use the word we are imploring, we are pleading. That really sounds like a government down on its knees. If you really want to if you really want to plead, if you really want to implore, why don't you meet Congress reasonably on their 3 key demands about GST? And let me take you through each of them one by one. First of all, Congress says the 1% interstate entry tax would have a cascading effect not just on inflation, but on the very concept of that. Why don't you agree to that?
No. You have to first understand that as far as the 1% is concerned, that is not is something that is going to result in cascading. The way we are working on that, the way it will eventually be settled in the GST bill, is that it is going to be set up so that it is supply of goods for a consideration. Therefore, our thinking is, and of course there is a subcommittee of the empowered committee that's looking into it, is that we can avoid the cascading effect. And in any case,
Congress isn't convinced by your answer, because what you talk about supply being excluded doesn't convince them.
No. It's supply for consideration.
Yeah.
Now, I think all people that have looked at the GST carefully and in detail recognize that it is possible, in fact, by constructing it in that fashion, to avoid the cascading.
So then this is one area where your imploring and pleading will not actually lead to your agreeing to one demand made by Congress. This demand you're not going to agree to. This will be a sticking point.
I think here we are going to plead with them to apply logic, to understand what we are saying, to go with what the expert opinion on this matter is, that it is in fact possible to have the 1% without the cascading
Let's come to their second demand. The second demand is right into the GST Act itself, a cap of 18%. And if I am right, Mr. Jaitley, in an article he wrote on the 2nd of August, says that there is some rationale to the Congress demand. And certainly international practice is around an 18% rate as well. So why don't you agree to this?
Because, Karan, the fact of the matter is we're looking to pass the constitutional amendment right now, not the GST bill. There's a difference between the amendment and the bill.
But indicate to Congress you're willing to accept this when you come to the bill stage?
No. We have said that we will set a reasonable rate. At this point, nobody can decide on what the rate has to be. That has to go through expert committee. There is already an expert committee that's been established by the Empowered Committee of State Finance Ministers. It's being studied in detail, and in any case, it's much too early to decide that. We have already said that we will look at a very reasonable rate, a rate that will actually power the economy forward. So therefore, I think the Congress's requirement that this be a reasonable rate and that reasonable rate be worked out should be done when the GST bill is presented.
Can I point out something to you? Pause and reflect upon the answers you've given me concerning GST. You began by saying you were going to implore and plead, suggesting on bended knees you'd be asking the opposition, agree to it, this is for the good of the country. Then when I put to you some key critical Congress demands, which if you concede to, they will help you pass GST, you've come up with very strong reasons why you can't agree to them. Therefore, your imploring and your pleading is not going to take you very far. And I come back to my
Karan,
original
maybe
question.
you implore, maybe you
happening.
implore and plead on bended knee. When I try and implore and plead in a negotiation, I do it through facts and logic. So in this case, what I'm presenting to you is precisely what I would present to my Congress colleagues.
In which case, those facts and logic that put you will not work with Congress.
Well, then in that case, they are clearly being illogical. They will continue to be illogical. So therefore, if they want to be illogical...
your language itself suggests you're not going to succeed. If you're calling Congress illogical, they're not going to come around to your position.
Well, then I am as I said, my style of trying to persuade people is on the basis of facts and logic.
Can I put this
and that's how I plead to them. Now, on the other hand, if they choose not to look at the facts and logic that all expert opinion and everybody would tend to agree with, and which is where the national consensus is right now, then I'm afraid it will be very difficult to move forward.
If GST doesn't roll out on the 1st of April 2016, and that is something most people now believe is beginning to look as if it will happen, what will be the impact on the investment climate in India? What will be the impact on the economy?
I think we are hopeful that we can still get it passed.
But if you don't?
If we don't get it passed, we will have to see how much the date slides. I mean, if we can't get it passed now, we will try to get it passed in the winter session. We will keep trying, of course.
But have you got enough time if you do only succeed in the winter session to get the states to pass it?
I think the legislative calendar will be very challenging if that were to be the case.
So what happens if you miss it for 1st April 2016? What's the impact on the economy? Share that with me.
So obviously, it will be a setback as far as the sentiment with respect to India's economic reforms agenda is concerned. Obviously, we are working on a number of other reform measures, and hopefully we'll be able to push those along faster. I think, investors tend to take the long-term view when it comes to India. I think they recognize that we are trying to forge a national consensus on GST as well.
Will they not be frustrated and fed up? Will not investors say to themselves, look, if this country with the majority that Mr. Modi has of 282 can't deliver on GST, can't deliver on land acquisition, then they might just turn their eyes away and look elsewhere.
Well, Karan, I don't think they're quite as concerned about, something happening in this session of Parliament or the next session of Parliament.
Of course they are, because if it doesn't happen in this session, it may not roll out in 1st April.
I speak to business people and investors all the time. And
Why is CII so concerned today? Why is there President Ajay Sriram issuing leading statements to Parliament
business
and to the
people and
government?
investors think about investing in India, they think about investing over a 10, 15, 20-year time horizon. And in that time horizon, whether it slips from this session or the next session is not such a big deal.
Okay.
Now, obviously, we have to do our very best, because every day that we don't have GST is a day lost. It's a very high opportunity cost, and therefore I think our friends at CII are certainly concerned about GST.
A moment ago,
and therefore, it is very important that we pass it as soon as possible. But people who are investing in India and thinking about India tend to think about it in the long term.
So you hope, and so you claim,
given the long-term national consensus that has been forged on GST, it will get passed very soon, I'm sure.
Let me put this to you. In the middle of that long answer, you actually did concede that if GST doesn't happen and if land acquisition doesn't happen, it would be a setback to the government's reform agenda. I want to ask you honestly, how serious a setback in your eyes to the government's economic agenda would this be?
Well, obviously, we are working on a portfolio of initiatives, as you might imagine, Karan. There are certain things that we had sequenced now, there are certain things we had sequenced later. So obviously, if on GST we cannot move ahead, then we will move ahead with other initiatives.
But how serious a setback will this be?
I wouldn't say it would be that serious, because we have a whole host of other things that we are working on. However,
that could actually replace GST and add 1.5% to GDP growth. Is GST good?
There are a variety of things we are working on.
Such as?
Of course, we will move those forward. We'll have to wait and see.
But give me an idea.
No, obviously we are working on what we can do as far as banking is concerned. We've announced important initiatives there. We are working on the National Infrastructure Fund and further expediting public investment in India. We will accelerate those efforts. So GST is vitally important to us, but of course we have contingency plans.
You're putting a brave face on this whole situation, and you're probably right to do so, but I imagine that there will be many who would be concerned that behind your brave face lies a certain measure of bluff. I want to quote to you Moody's Analytics, which just 4 days ago came up with the following sentiment and statement about your government's handling of reform. The jury is still out on Prime Minister Modi, but the government's failure to deliver on promised reforms is a major impediment to broader economic growth momentum in the country. 1 year, 3 months down the road, that's a pretty damning thing for Moody's to say after the high hopes they'd held out when you became a government in May last year.
Well, I think if our Congress colleagues work with us to pass GST, they'll certainly change their opinion.
But they're not.
Well, if they're not, then we'll work on other reform initiatives that probably Moody has not yet considered as they wrote the report.
Do you know what Moody says in that same report? And you know it probably better than me, that if you can't pass GST this year, if you can't pass land acquisition amendments, and if you don't push through flexible labour law reforms, and you aren't even thinking of the latter, you're not going to achieve any growth above 7.5% of GDP.
Well, that's Moody's opinion. We have obviously a different opinion. As I said, Karan, we are working on a portfolio of initiatives. There are important things we are doing as far as infrastructure is concerned. The important things that we are doing as far as our banks are concerned.
Investors, and you're relying heavily on international investors.
But Karan, let's look at the facts. If you look at FDI is up dramatically in India. It's up 40% in comparable period last year. If you look at foreign portfolio flows right now, you'll find while there are outflows from the rest of the emerging markets, $15 billion has come to India this year. As you listen to
that
the kind of money...
That will continue after land acquisition fails to pass? That will continue after GST fails to happen?
I think, again, you're making a mistake I find a lot of people make again, and I'd advise you to use your words carefully. The reality is that land acquisition was not intended for private purpose. It's intended for public purpose, for the government's acquisition of land, not for the private acquisition of land.
Except that it was going to be used for industrial corridors where private industry was going to set up, which would provide jobs, which would provide employment, which would create demand. If none of that is going to happen because that acquisition of land is not going to be made easier, that is not just a setback, it will put off investors, both domestic and foreign. And you know that better than me.
Like I said, there's a portfolio of initiatives we're working on, and there are many other things that we're doing that I think will provide tremendous...
You have rabbits to cheer up the market just at this moment of impending gloom.
It's called service to the nation, and if you're in service to the nation, then obviously you'll work on a wide array of things, and if one set of initiatives is delayed, then there's another set of initiatives.
Moody's is also particularly skeptical, if not more seriously doubtful, of steps that you're taking on the manufacturing front. They point out, and you know this better than Moody's does, the private investment in manufacturing is simply not picking up. Do you share Moody's concern that despite the enormous emphasis the Prime Minister has put on Made in India, manufacturing is not picking up?
Well, I think Made in India is paying very, very rich dividends now, Karan, because if you look at the kind of investments that are pouring in from global businesses right now, whether it is what SoftBank is saying, whether it's what General Motors is saying, whether it's what Ford is saying or Amazon is saying, we find foreign investment, particularly for Make in India, really, really pouring.
Then why is Moody's so concerned? Because they would know what foreign investment is doing before you and I do.
They are doing their analysis, and obviously,
so are they wrong?
We are seeing.
Are they wrong?
I think they are taking a very short-term view of what we see as coming down the pike in terms of investments in manufacturing from a number of global businesses. Now, as far as
Moody's doesn't recognize the virtue of domestic consensus and democratic consensus that you stressed so much when you were explaining land acquisition. Are you hopeful they'll see it in those terms?
You seem to give Moody undue importance. I don't. They are one analytical firm, one agency that looks at what's happening in India, the IMF, the World Bank, and most importantly, investors that put their money where their mouth is, and they're certainly putting a lot of money into India.
And they'll continue to do it even though land acquisition amendments don't happen, even though GST doesn't happen. That's the big catch.
There are already many opportunities in India. There are many opportunities to be able to take advantage of the land banks that already exist. And of course, we will find a way to keep powering India's economy forward.
Finally, let's come to the last issue I want to raise with you, the financial code that is being discussed, and it's getting a fair measure of adverse comment, as you know. Let me ask you a simple question. Is the finance code the government's thinking on the subject? Is this what you're committed to? Is this what you're proposing to do?
I'll have to correct you. I think the material that's getting a lot of press right now is actually the press on the Monetary Policy Committee. There are a number of other elements.
Part of it.
There are a number of elements in the IFC that are there. Unfortunately, some of them have not got the attention that they deserve, and of course, everybody has been fixated
on the policy committee. Is what's out in the public domain the government's thinking?
The government gets inputs from many different sources. The IFC got a lot of suggestions once draft 1.0 was put together. That was collated by the government. That was then reviewed by Sri Krishna committee. Sri Krishna worked on it with a couple of other people. people, and that was then synthesized and put up on the Finance Ministry website.
But you're not answering my question.
But Mr. Maharishi correctly said that that is an input into the government's thinking. I myself have clearly also said that that is not the government's position. The government's position is being worked through right now.
So just for clarity.
And as Dr. Rajan said today at the Monetary Policy Review, we are close to putting together something that will be, we think, a very robust solution.
You're saying to me very clearly that what is out in the public domain is not the government's position.
With respect to either the IFC or the Monetary Policy Committee, it is the committee report that was put together by Justice Sri Krishna that then got a lot of different suggestions and was put up on the Finance Minister's website. It is not government policy.
Then let me quote to you what Justice Sri Krishna actually said to the Hindu newspaper today, and it's on the front page of the Hindu newspaper. The revised draft of the IFC is FSLRC's recommendation as modified by the Government of India. It is neither my view nor is it FSLRC's view. It reflects the government's view. He says this is the government's position. You say it's not.
Well, let me explain to you what the difference is between his interpretation and what I am saying. What I am saying is the government collated and collected a whole host of...
What does collated mean in this context?
Collated means a process of editing. Okay, it means a process of editing. It means a process of parsing. There were thousands of comments received. They were collated, compiled, synthesized, and then put up on the Finance Ministry's website. They did not represent government policy. They did represent an editing task that was undertaken by the Finance Ministry.
All right. I accept your position. I think it's important that we clarified that Justice Sri Krishna's comment to the Hindu is not necessarily 100% correct. You have clarified that
I think there are different interpretations. He has an interpretation.
The facts are that this is something that the government has collated. It is not the government's final official position.
I think that is very clearly what Mr. Maharishi said, what the CEA, Mr. Subramaniam said, and what I'm saying.
Let me then ask you three important questions. Are you proposing or are you in favor of diluting the governor of the Reserve Bank's powers to set the exchange rate?
We are in favor of a monetary policy committee that is institutionalized, that represents a diversity of opinions and in which all points of view can be appropriately represented.
In which case, do you believe that the majority of the members of that monetary policy committee should be appointed by the government?
We'll have to see what the final recommendations are.
But what's your position? You must have some thinking which you can share with the people of India.
That is the government's opinion, and we'll have to see how that
What is the government's opinion?
No, we'll have to wait and see. It is not yet in the public domain.
So at the moment the government doesn't have an opinion, or is it that the government won't reveal its opinion?
It is something that is under consultation right now and in discussion between the government and the Reserve Bank of India. And so as and when that is finalized, it will be revealed.
So in fact, the government's opinion is still being drafted and created. You don't have a final opinion. It's under consultation.
I wouldn't use the word opinion. In this context, it's not meaningful. The word I would use is that we want to have an overall set of conclusions on this matter. Those conclusions are currently under discussion.
So you're still striving for a conclusion. You haven't reached a conclusion on how the members of the monetary committee are appointed.
As Mr. Maharishi said and Dr. Rajan said, we are close to a conclusion, but that conclusion has not yet been announced.
A second key question. Should the governor have a veto in that monetary policy committee?
We'll have to see what the conclusions say on that subject.
So again, you have no conclusion on that?
That is under consideration. The process of finalizing those conclusions is underway.
Finally, if he doesn't have a veto, should he have a casting vote?
Again, as I said, you'll have to wait and see what the conclusions are, Karan. You're fishing for the answer, which of course...
Absolutely. No, I'm not fishing for the answer. I'm actually clarifying something else, which is on all three important issues. Who appoints the majority of the members, the veto or a casting vote? On all three, you're saying to me you haven't arrived at a government position.
I have said that there is a process of deliberation, a process at arriving at a conclusion.
Which is not complete.
That process is underway right now. As soon as, and we've made very good progress, Mr. Maharishi and Dr. Rajan have clearly indicated that, and as soon as that is concluded and we come to a final position, we will be very happy to tell everyone.
So when you say you haven't got a final position, clearly you haven't made up your mind. The government is still in the process of making up its mind.
I think you need some instructions in how democracy and consultations actually work, Karan. Because the reality is that when there are interesting perspectives and interesting viewpoints that have to be reconciled and balanced, as I was saying earlier, there is a process of consultation and recognition of what needs to be factored in before a final conclusion can be arrived at.
All right. I think you're saying what I'm saying, just in longer words.
No, I'm saying something different. It is again a question.
I'm not sure if I understand the difference.
Then I'm sure you'll have to think about it.
If you haven't reached a conclusion, it means you haven't made up your mind.
No, that doesn't mean that. It means that there may be multiple parties. Each party may have made up its mind, but there is a process of consultation by which a consensus can be forged, and that
consensus hasn't been forged.
But there is a difference, Karan. The consensus represents the coming together of various perspectives that may differ from your initial position.
You're a sophistical rhetorician as well as a very good man with words. And once again, like the argument of democratic consensus, you're actually blinding me with language. But in fact, I'm going to say to the audience that I get the clear feeling you're agreeing with me, the government hasn't made up its mind, but you won't say it so bluntly.
You, Karan, are very good at putting words in people's mouth, but you will have to go with what I have said.
My last question to you, and it's to do with, in fact, the thoughts and sentiments and feelings and concerns and criticisms about the financial code that are out in the public domain. This is what Moody's Analytics has said. It says if the code as they believe exists is implemented, credibility would be lower, politics would drive decisions, and transparency would be reduced. And they conclude this would weigh on India's economic prospects, particularly its financial market stability. Would you bear this sort of concern and advice in mind when you come to your conclusion?
You know, all good advice is something we consider as we come to a conclusion, as we were discussing earlier, Karan. So certainly we'll take on board what Moody's is saying. We've got a lot of other stakeholder opinions that we've heard and we've consulted with, and all of that will be in this process of forging a consensus, of developing a perspective that reconciles all these different conflicting opinions.
Minister, thank you very much for answering all my questions with such good cheer.